So this video was not supposed to happen. I'm in the middle of a very big project. It's another deep dive into something you've probably heard of this time. But today I saw a video from Chen, and it just really pissed me off. So here I am making a response video to it because there were so many factual errors in it, so many ridiculous statements that I couldn't help myself. So let's dive into this video. It's titled Immigration Crisis. Take more migrants, says UN.
As Global News reports, quote, the United Nations is urging Canada to help ease Mexico's refugee burden by helping resettle some of the most vulnerable of its new arrivals, including women, children, and LGBTQ2 people. Mexico is feeling the squeeze from an unprecedented exodus of people fleeing Central American countries. And some of the worst violence from nations not actually at war is forcing families northward. Our pitch to Canada is to do more, said Mark Manley, the Mexico representative of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. The article continues that the request comes as the United States takes a harder line on its Mexican border, with President Donald Trump branding the caravans of migrants as being laced with violent criminals bent on destabilizing his country.
Oh look, the first error. We're not talking about migrants crossing borders here. We're talking about refugees being resettled. The way the refugee resettlement process works is that someone fleeing their country applies for asylum. And if they're granted asylum and given refugee status, they can then apply to be moved somewhere else. We're talking about people who have fled Central America to Mexico, applied for asylum, been given refugee status, and then are being transferred over to Canada. They shouldn't be considered vaguely defined migrants. These are vetted refugees. Here's an example of the numbers Chen loves so much. The ones that seem like they're arguing for her point, but when you actually dig into them, don't really do that.
In 2018, under the leadership of Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party, Canada resettled more refugees than any other country. As the BBC reports, the country accepted just over 28,000 refugees last year, with the United States coming in second with 22,900. But to anyone who would ask Canada to do more, those numbers should tell you that we have already done more than enough.
The reason Canada, the United States, and Australia rank so high for resettlement numbers is because it's very difficult for refugees to get here. They'd basically have to swim across the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean just to get to Canada. So generally, they don't have to worry about a lot of refugees showing up at their borders. If we look at the BBC article Chen cites, it mentions that there are 70 million people who are currently displaced. 70 million. Canada resettled 28,000. Consider that disparity for a moment. You might be wondering where these people are. The top 5 countries currently taking care of refugees are Turkey with 3.7 million refugees, Pakistan with 1.4 million refugees, Uganda with 1.2 million, Sudan with 1.1 million, and Germany with 1.1 million. That 28,000 number isn't exactly accurate. That was just how many Canada took in within 2018 itself. The total number of refugees currently living in Canada is 114,109. And there are currently 78,806 asylum seekers. The difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker is that an asylum seeker is generally someone who is applying for refugee status. A refugee is actually a legally defined term, one that is given to someone who has been properly vetted by, for example, the UNHCR, which is the UN Refugee Agency. From here, the video turns into a lot of generic, vague UN bashing. She actually made a whole video where she criticizes the UN, and she doesn't seem to understand it and what it's supposed to do, so she just seems to think it does nothing.
Think of it. What national long-term policies which have made countries better can the UN take credit for?
The UN isn't responsible for national policy. That would be the responsibility of a nation's federal government. The UN isn't a governing body. I don't know how to explain this more simply. If you're complaining that the UN hasn't fixed these nations, whatever that means, it's not because the UN hasn't been trying. It all depends on the participation of the member nations to make it all work.
What the UN tries to pitch as them improving the world is simply moving people from bad countries to good countries.
And then she says something like this, where she's under the impression that the UN's primary goal has been to relocate people through its refugee program. The UNHCR's mission is not to fix countries with any sort of internal strife. It's to protect the well-being of people who have been displaced. I don't know why the UN is being defined by a single program that operates under the General Assembly and then being judged for not meeting these other unnamed goals, but it's an absurdly reductist reading of one of the most important institutions in the world. And if you want a list of some of the things the UN has done, it's helped eradicate smallpox. I think that's pretty good. Through UNICEF, it's saved the lives of tens of millions of children. It's helped reduce the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The General Assembly's clamping down on South Africa helped end apartheid in the region. It's actually done a lot of really great things in the world, and I'll include links with even more stuff it's done in the description box. Let's take a moment to see Lauren fail to read.
Article 14 of the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. I'm sorry, no. How on earth is that a human right? I mean, I guess you could say you have the right to seek asylum. You can seek whatever you want, I suppose. But you don't have the right to enjoy asylum in other countries. Where would that right come from?
No, that's not how you read that. No one is saying everyone can simply be granted asylum on request. The term enjoy asylum means that no person should ever be forbidden from being granted asylum. That is, someone who has gone through the asylum application process and been granted refugee status. Pretty much every country in the world has some number of refugees living in it, so the fact that this simple article blows Lauren's mind shows how little she understands the process. Literally, no country on earth, as far as I know, grants asylum to anyone who shows up and asks for it. There's always a vetting process, and considering the UNHCR helps manage a lot of these vetting processes, I think they support them.
Not to mention that persecution is just such a vague word. Essentially, all it means is ill treatment or hostility.
No, it doesn't. Okay, let's actually do something fun and talk about what a refugee is actually defined as, according to the UNHCR. A refugee is someone who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. A refugee has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Most likely, they cannot return home or are afraid to do so. War and ethnic, tribal, and religious violence are leading causes of refugees fleeing their countries. That seems pretty specific. Lauren seems to be under the impression that there is no vetting process.
Everybody in that country gets to just leave and choose another country to move to, and it has to be granted because it's their human right to seek asylum? Does any Western European person who speaks out against Islam or mass immigration, what they call hate speech over there, get to come to the US and seek asylum under this declaration? Is that how that works?
That's weird. I hear a lot of anti-Islam stuff coming out of Western Europe all the time, but I guess they're being persecuted somewhere? Okay. As far as I can tell, no one from Western Europe has applied for asylum because they've been persecuted for speaking out against Islam. They can try that. I don't think that application's going to turn out so well. The fact that she thinks the UNHCR sees no difference between that and someone who's trying to escape a war zone, it stretches my ability to believe she's being a serious person. Now she's going to say something even more ridiculous.
What the UN is saying is that it would be someone's human right to just show up at your country and say, hey, I'm going to enjoy asylum here. And in order to not violate their rights, not only would you have to let them in, but you would also be obligated to give them food, housing, and clothing. You!
I'm genuinely stunned at this. Okay, leaving aside Lauren's outrage at the idea that all people should have access to food and shelter, somehow confusing it with the UN advocating some sort of socialist nanny state, I think that's how she's reading it. Leaving all that aside, an asylum seeker actually is entitled to food and shelter. The reason asylum seekers are giving these things is because once they apply for asylum, they are essentially in the custody of the government in which they're applying to. When a government takes a person into custody, it's expected to provide them food and shelter. This is truly basic stuff, and Lauren's response to the idea that people the government takes into custody should be given food and shelter is...
You!
I wonder if she could be so brazen to say this to some of the refugee children currently staying in Mexico after fleeing their homes in Central America. You know the exact people the original article she mentioned was discussing, the people who are fleeing gang violence and who are often the target. Boys for recruitment, girls for much worse than that. When they would come seeking asylum, the idea of giving them food and shelter, Lauren would say,
You!
Okay.
And frankly, the entire asylum process right now just needs to be revamped. As it stands, anyone can show up at your border, request asylum. You have to clothe them, feed them, provide them medical attention, even if you don't end up letting them in.
Yes, you do have to do that. Absolutely. If someone applies for asylum and is willing to be taken into the custody of the government and go through that lengthy process, yes, you do have to provide food and shelter for them.
There needs to be stricter guidelines of who does and does not qualify so you don't end up with entire countries showing up at your border demanding to be let in because their life would be better if they lived in your country.
She seems to think this is something that people will take advantage of. People will show up at a nation's borders and demand asylum because they really want to stay locked up in a hotel somewhere for 3 months or really have much of a life. Apparently to her that seems like something people would swim across the Atlantic Ocean or fly here just to do that. Until an entire country shows up, requests asylum so they can be locked up here for a couple of months, I don't think the system needs to be revamped for something that isn't happening.
If country A is experiencing mass violence, sectarian warfare, or in general is failing economically, what do you think moving everyone out of that country and putting them in a different country is going to do?
Save their lives.
Do you think these people will just start magically behaving differently because their geography has changed? Sure, some individuals will be fine and be able to acclimate and succeed, but we're not talking about individually screening people, are we? No, we're talking about mass relocation. We're not talking about resettling individuals, we're resettling groups.
She seems to think that asylum is something that's granted en masse with no real screening or vetting. That's not how it works. People are screened individually when applying for asylum. Vetting has always been a part of the refugee process, and typically the people who are causing the problems in that country generally aren't trying to go somewhere else. No one who's a brutal dictator in, say, Syria, for example, is going to pack up their life, go live as a refugee in Sweden somewhere. They're going to continue living on in the place where they can freely oppress and brutalize the citizenry. This is about helping people who are trying to escape that. The fact that she doesn't understand this, the fact that she sees them as like parasites who are coming to suck the resources out of a country, it's truly revolting, and it shows how little she understands what it means to be a refugee. What's especially worrying was glancing at the comments section and all the people complaining about illegal immigration. Here's one comment that Lauren herself liked. Dear Lauren, my parents were legal immigrants to the US. They applied to the US, they waited the necessary 5 years, and then moved legally to the US. My parents were DPs in Europe, meaning they had been displaced by the war and could not go back to their countries at the end of the war because their countries had been overrun by communists. I have absolutely no care whatsoever about the illegals. If they want to come here, legally let them go through the process. Applying for asylum and being granted refugee status is the legal process. This is not about illegal immigration. There are a number of other comments that make references to illegal immigration, and if I were Lauren, I would be alarmed that so many people in my comments are so misinformed. They don't even understand what the video is about. But then again, Lauren doesn't even understand what she's talking about, so it's not a surprise that her viewers are similarly misinformed. It really depresses me. Refugees are some of the most vulnerable people in the world. When I see this sort of nonsense being pushed against them, it makes me really angry. And I probably sound more sad than angry right now because I've had a couple of hours to cool off, write this little script out in a bit of a fury, and now I just feel kind of sad. Sad to think how campaigning like this reduces the number of refugees who are, again, granted that specific status and are being turned away because there's all this misinformation from people who really have no interest in allowing others in. These are the sentiments that leads to overcrowding in refugee camps because the native population sees them as a threat. These are the words and ideas that create this fiction that refugees are a danger and are likely to cause crime and trouble in their host nations, something the stats don't really support. I want us to do better than this. We can do better than these ideas, these sentiments, and I hope one day we will. So this video is a bit of a venting. Again, I wasn't planning on making this video. I'm doing this one very quickly because I'm in the midst of a very large project. It's another deep dive into another video about refugees. This video is already longer than I expected. I just want to close it up by thanking all my patrons. Their names are on the screen, and they are some truly lovely people. If you would like to be as wonderful as those patrons, you can head over to my Patreon and donate whatever you're comfortable with, whatever is in your means. Please don't go hungry on account of giving me money, but I do appreciate every little bit someone can spare me, because these videos are a labor of love, and it takes a bit of time out of my life to produce them, and I appreciate everyone who watches them, everyone who subscribes, likes, leaves a comment. I do this for all of you, and I hope it's appreciated. And if it's not, I don't know, go watch a Lauren Chen video. Or no, don't watch that. Go outside, live, enjoy your life. But please understand that there are people out there sitting in refugee camps who could be resettled to a nation and enjoy a life as well, if only it weren't for demagogues like Lauren Chen speaking out against them. Thanks for watching.